Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. A number of interesting things going on, some good, some bad. It's been a very interesting competition between Elon Musk with SpaceX, who's believed in the launch them quickly, let them blow up, learn from it, launch again, keep going to breakthrough, and the approach that Jeff Bezos has taken, which is much slower, much calmer, etc. And Bezos, unfortunately, just had a brutal introduction to reality. He's building a huge rocket, not as big as the Starship that Musk is building, but a very, very big rocket called the New Glenn. And it exploded during a test. It wasn't taking off yet. They were testing all the parts of it. And obviously they had a problem because it just blew up on the test pad. That's a real challenge because this is an integral part of getting to the moon with people. And that is also the key to the future of Blue Origin, which is Bezos' company. Now, it's not financially a problem. Bezos is enormously wealthy, and they're going to go back. They think they'll launch again another version of the rocket in the very near future. But they were hoping to launch 48 satellites into low Earth orbit to help Amazon expand its broadband capabilities, sort of in competition with Elon Musk and the work he's been doing. Earlier this month, NASA announced that it had awarded Blue Origin a $188 million contract to deliver lunar terrain vehicles, that is, vehicles that can run around on the surface of the moon. That's still in place, but I think people were a little sobered. Jared Isaacman, the administrator of NASA, put out a note saying, this is a reminder of how difficult and how challenging getting to the moon and to Mars is, and that we have to persevere, but we have to be a little humbled to realize just how complicated and how difficult it is. On a different front, there is a new executive order on artificial intelligence. President Trump signed an order, quote, promoting advanced intelligence, innovation, and security, essentially asking the tech companies to voluntarily submit their new AI models for government cybersecurity tests before releasing them to the public. This is an area which I'm writing in actually on a book that will come out this fall called America's Golden Age. And it's a very complicated area. And I think that we are just scratching the surface of how challenging artificial intelligence is going to be. This new executive order gives the government a 30-day window to review new artificial intelligence models before they're publicly released. So we'll see what happens. Coming up, I'm joined by Dr. Gad Saad, scholar at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi and author of the New York Times bestseller, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to be Kind. That's next. I am really pleased to welcome back my guest and good friend, Dr. Gad Saad. He is currently a scholar at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi. He's also a professor of marketing at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and former holder of the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. His new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to be Kind, is a New York Times bestseller. Gad, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back on, Speaker Gingrich.
Your new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to be Kind, debuted at number 1 on the New York Times for nonfiction bestseller list. What do you think explains the strong reaction the book has received?
I think it really puts the finger on the exact reason that we are seeing all of the domestic and foreign policy fiascos, right? Empathy is a wonderful virtue to have. We are a social species, and therefore it makes perfect sense that we have certain traits, certain virtues that serve as a social lubricants for our interactions. For you and I to have a meaningful conversation, I need to put myself in your mind and vice versa. That's called cognitive empathy or theory of mind. So there's nothing wrong with well-modulated empathy. The problem is that, as Aristotle explained to us several thousand years ago, Too little of something is not good. Too much of something is not good. And much of life is about finding that sweet spot. And that's exactly what applies to empathy. If I have no empathy, I'm likely to be a psychopath. If I have hyperactive empathy that is invoked in the wrong situations toward the wrong targets, you end up with suicidal empathy. And I think that's why the book is resonating with people.
Describe for me, how does suicidal empathy manifest itself?
Much of the book is about precisely demonstrating many, many cases, some of which seem like they are out of a mixture of Orwellian and Kafkaesque dystopia. I mean, really, they're just unbelievable. But let's discuss arguably the most nefarious form of suicidal empathy, although we can drill down to a whole bunch of other examples if you'd like. Having an open border immigration policy where your starting position is all immigrants are equally likely to assimilate. It is wrong for you to argue that this group is less likely to contribute to the host society than that group is a form of suicidal empathy. And it originally stems from what I talked about in one of my previous books, The Parasitic Mind, where I talked about how parasitic ideas can infect the human mind. So take, for example, cultural relativism. It purports that you're in no position to judge the actions and beliefs and practices of another culture. If they wish to engage in female genital mutilation of 5-year-old girls, shut up, racist. If they wish to have child brides, shut up, racist. Well, if you internalize that parasitic idea, it then renders you impotent to have a sane immigration policy, because then I could no longer say that the average person from Waziristan is less likely to assimilate in the United States than a person from Denmark. All people are equally kind, equally good, equally likely to assimilate. And then you end up with all of the problems that we're seeing in the West. So that would probably be the worst manifestation of suicidal empathy.
You suggest that this inability to have some kind of judgment has resulted in a society, and this is a great quote, galloping rapidly toward the abyss of infinite lunacy. What do you mean?
I'd like to say almost an American, because I'm on my way to becoming one, God willing. Many Americans are sort of in a apathetic stupor where they think that some of the things that folks like me escaped from 50 years ago in Lebanon won't happen here. Well, that's just because you need to give it enough time for it to happen, right? We now do have Dearborn, Michigan. We now do have Patterson, New Jersey. We now do have some of the dynamics that are happening in Minnesota. And the reason why those things are happening is that once you get beyond a tipping point of a concentration of people that don't share your deontological foundational principles, you will be galloping eventually towards the abyss of infinite lunacy, right? I mean, the United States, it is not magical because it has the Rockies or because it has the Grand Canyon. It's because it has internalized as part of its ethos a set of principles that make the United States an exceptional society. If you bring in people into your country that do not in the least bit share in those foundational principles, you will fall off the abyss of infinite lunacy. It just takes a bit of time.
Those people are explicitly rejecting the American contract. It's not that they don't care. It's that they regard us as the problem.
Exactly. So let me give you an example of that in the context of Islam, which is the worst manifestation of suicidal empathy in terms of an open border immigration policy. Islam breaks up the world into two camps. And I'm going to say them in Arabic and then I'll translate in English. There is Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb means the house of war. Dar al-Islam is the house of Islam. So the world is broken up into countries that are already under the full dominion of Islam, in which case they are at peace. And then all of the other countries that have yet to fall under the dominion of Islam, and therefore they are literally in the house of war. Now, that doesn't mean that every Muslim invokes that principle as they go about their daily lives, but it does mean that once Islam takes up a dominant role in a given society, I can predict for you with perfect certainty what will happen to the personal liberties and freedoms of those people in those societies. We've got 1400 years of data, right? Most of the scientific studies that have ever been published in any scientific discipline don't have the statistical power of looking at the last 1400 years and what happens when Islam takes over. Again, individual Muslims are perfectly nice and lovely or not, just like in any other grouping. We're talking about Islam as a codified set of ideas. Do we want more of it? If yes, bring on everybody. If no, maybe rethink your immigration policies.
Well, and I think you then also have to rethink your education policy. There are a whole range of things here that fall into place once you decide you're explicitly going to be American.
Exactly, right? I mean, look, I'm Canadian, born in Lebanon, Jewish. I'm now, as you kindly stated in the introduction, starting in August, I will be the distinguished professor at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. Now, why does it take a Canadian to be holding that position? Because I internalized within the ethos of my personhood all of those American freedoms. I don't come to the United States to then rail day in and day out with a keffiyeh on campus about how evil the United States. To the contrary, I'm infinitely grateful that I've been allowed to flourish in the United States, and I will do whatever I can to defend those freedoms. So imagine if you let in millions of people who in no way share what I just said. It doesn't take a fancy professor to predict what will happen long term.
When we come back, we'll discuss how suicidal empathy shapes real-world policy from crime to homelessness. One of the major themes of your book, which I will remind people is a New York Times #1 bestseller already, is that a lot of the West's most controversial policies are in fact driven by this misplaced compassion, which goes way beyond just the border, but you end up with things like homelessness and a whole range of other issues. How did you come to that conclusion?
Let me explain the narrative of how these two books, The Parasitic Mind and Suicidal Empathy, go together as a sort of unified narrative. We are both a thinking and a feeling animal, right? Both our cognitive system shapes the decisions we make, but so does our emotional system. So, for example, we know that in advertising, if you wish to convince someone to persuade them to buy a product, depending on the type of product, I will either invoke your cognitive system or your affective system. So, for example, if I'm trying to sell you a mutual fund, I will develop an advertising campaign that caters to your cognitive system. Here are the 7 rational reasons why you should invest in my mutual fund. On the other hand, if I'm trying to sell you a hedonic product like a perfume, I don't tell you this is what Harvard physiologists think about the science of olfaction. I will show you a beautiful girl on a horse with luxuriant hair, and I will give you a brand name that's French sounding. Mystère. I am trying to invoke your affective system. So now let's apply this to what we're talking about. I argued in The Parasitic Mind that in the same way that the human mind can be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, it can also be parasitized by ideological brainworms. But that's only half the story. For me to completely own your ability to engage in critical thinking, I also have to hijack your affective system. And so in Suicidal Empathy, what I'm arguing is that I am parasitizing your affective system through pathological, dysregulated empathy.
In some ways, your argument is very similar. There's a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, which also makes the argument that starting with the Great Society, we went to a model of how humans function, which is just plain wrong. In a sense, you now have this weird combination on the left of people who are committed to programs that don't work, so they can't really look at them, because if they looked at them, they'd have to change them, and they're committed to the programs, combined with people who are profoundly anti-American. And that is the coalition of those two that makes them potentially capable of achieving power in the country. And when you look at it, I mean, I watched somebody like Mondami in New York, or you watch the California primary, right? And you realize, New York City is decaying, all of California is decaying, and people are going to go out and vote for the decay.
By the way, as a Jewish person, nothing upsets me more than what I call wood cricket Jews. These are the Jews that are standing in the line going, vote for Mamdani. Nothing gives me greater sort of repulsion than the sheep that are saying, free the wolves. And in this case, it is, super liberal Jews that can't see beyond their nose and their, moral piety. But let me go back to your earlier point about something that enacting policies that are contrary to human nature. And by the way, that's very relevant to my work in evolutionary psychology, right? Because as you mentioned at the start of the show, I held the chaired professorship in evolutionary behavioral sciences. Well, what does that mean? It means that to fully understand human behavior, you must understand the evolved biological imperatives that cause us to behave the way that we do. So now let's apply that to politics. E.O. Wilson, the very famous Harvard entomologist who recently passed away, he studied social ants. Social ants are communistic in that there is a reproductive queen, then there's a bunch of worker ants and a bunch of soldier ants that are indistinguishable from each other. When he was asked once, Professor Wilson, what are your views on communism? He paused and said, one of the greatest responses I've ever heard. He said, great idea, wrong species. Now, what is that saying right there? It's saying that you have to understand the phylogenetic history of a species to know whether a particular social organization is congruent with its nature or not. So when you impose a socio-political economic system like communism on human beings that are not communistic. Some of us are taller, shorter, harder working, less harder working. It's not surprising that it's always going to fail. But rest assured, Speaker Gingrich, Bernie Sanders and AOC are going to institute true communism once they get the power.
After Gorbachev left power, he went on a speaking tour, and he ended up at Stanford, and this guy was with him one night at a dinner at Stanford. And one of the Stanford professors said to him, communism didn't fail. It was the Russian method of implementation. And Gorbachev stared at him and said, you would have to be an American professor to believe that.
Oh, I love it. Is this published anywhere? Because I'd love to quote that story.
The congressman who was at the dinner told me the story personally.
To your point, by the way, I've often said that it uniquely takes intellectuals to come up with the most devastatingly bad ideas. And I mean, Thomas Sowell has made a similar argument in his work. Of course, George Orwell argued that 67 years ago. And the reason for that is because most professors exist in a bubble that is fully decoupled from the autocorrective mechanism of reality, right? So I can stand on my pulpit, look at a bunch of 20-year-olds who don't know anything, and I can pontificate about the fact that there are really 646 sexes. That's progressive science, and nobody will slap me back into reality. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why some disciplines are inherently less likely to be parasitized by all of that parasitic stupidity. Not fully inoculated, but less likely. And those are the applied disciplines. So the business school, the engineering school is less likely to have such stupidity, because if I build a bridge using postmodernist feminist physics, well, the bridge is going to collapse. If I build an economic model of consumer choice using lesbian dance theory, well, I'm not going to predict much of what consumers do. So because those fields are inherently wedded to reality, you get less imbecility.
I'm actually writing a book on 2076, and part of it is about the collapse of the classic education bureaucracies. And they got big enough, to your point, that they could create their own fantasy world. And then they could punish you, not give you tenure, flunk you out of school, a variety of things, if you did not concede that their fantasies were real.
Exactly. By the way, exactly to what you just said. Imagine being yours truly in academia for 32 years. I mean, really, it must be one of the great miracles of life that I've been able to actually exist and not be canceled. I mean, just recently, just in the past day or two, if you saw some of the astounding venom that I've received from, quote, fellow academics who simply cannot stomach the existential reality that this dreadful monster, this neo-Nazi Jewish professor, is at the #1 bestseller on New York Times. If you see the unhinged, hysteric hatred, it's simply astounding. So thank God I found an American university in the Deep South that actually is wedded to reason.
You said to me years ago that you'd been, as a very young person, through the civil war in Lebanon, and that in Montreal you would begin to see the same pattern on the college campus. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize. For some reason, the left has a hatred and a militancy which is not matched by the rest of the country. They dominate by sheer vitriol.
They do. I'll tell you a quick story about the vitriol. I mean, it's the left, but in this case, it's leftist professors. Most professors are astoundingly leftist, right? I mean, it depends on which discipline you're in, but in most of the activist disciplines, you're much more likely to run into a unicorn than to run into a conservative professor. But in any case, a few years ago, I was speaking a plenary lecture at USC, University of Southern California. It was a event to sort of discuss the values of the Age of Enlightenment. And my lecture was on the tension between deontological versus consequentialist ethics, so very academic talk. But of course, most of the professors who were in the audience knew my dark secret, which was that I actually had supported Donald Trump, even though I was living in Canada, but I wasn't walking around all day screaming that Donald Trump and the Republicans are neo-Nazis who are going to be an existential threat on humanity and so on. If you saw during the Q&A, the incredible vitriol that I had. Now, I was very, very calm, very cool. And then my then daughter, who was 13 years old, at the end of it comes up to me. She was in the audience. My whole family was there. She says, "I don't know how you do it, Daddy. If I could do it, I would gouge the eyes of every one of those people." So the fact that a 13-year-old innocent child can have this kind of invoked anger at how they're treating their dad tells you what the state of academia looks like.
You make a point about public policy that the whole homeless issue reflects the kind of position you're describing, where people at one level are supposedly empathetic, but the consequence of their empathy is a disaster. It actually makes life worse.
Exactly.
Could you describe that?
Right. And it applies, as you mentioned maybe a few minutes ago, to homelessness, to the criminal justice issues and, soft on crime policies. So let's step back a second and discuss a really important phenomenon in psychology, and it's known as the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias basically argues that there are different ways by which I can ascribe causality to the successes and failures in my life. Most people attribute successes internally. I did well on the exam because I'm a smart guy and I studied hard. It's because of me that I did well. And they then attribute failures externally. I did poorly on the exam because Professor Saad is a mean bastard, right? And for most people, that's a perfectly reasonable, albeit illusory, way to navigate through life because it protects my ego, right? It's an ego defensive strategy. Now imagine if you have one party, in this case, the progressives and the Democrats, whereby they ascribe all nefarious things that happen to society to external agents. Those who actually engage in those behaviors don't have personal agency. So the homeless person could never have done something that led to him being homeless. It's probably because he lives in a very unfair society. Now, don't get me going if I'm a progressive on felons of color, or as I call them, blank slate felons. Now, why do I say blank slate felons? Because there is a pervasive idea in the social sciences that human beings are born tabula rasa, empty minds, with equal potentiality, and whichever trajectory their life takes could only be because of external factors. So if I am a black felon who's only been arrested 187 previous times, don't you think I am deserving of a second chance? And by that I mean a 188th chance at kicking the can? Because I was born into a white supremacist society rooted in slavery. So I've already been punished. How mean must you be to then punish me by actually presuming that I have personal agency? An empathetic person would not do such a thing. There's your suicidal empathy.
Yeah, I was going to say the degree to which the left is desperate to avoid holding people responsible is just, I think, one of the most astounding phenomena of our time. Coming up, we'll discuss his early life in Lebanon and his experience in the West and how it shaped his thinking about freedom, culture, and the growing concerns he sees in Western institutions today. You were born in Lebanon. When did you all leave?
So we left at the end of the first year of the Civil War. So in April 1975, the Civil War broke out in Lebanon. And as you well know, Speaker Gingrich, the brutality of wars usually measured against the standard of the Lebanese Civil War, which was just a orgiastic bath of brutality. So we had been one of the last holdouts of the Lebanese Jewish community in Beirut. Much of our extended family had already sort of read the writing on the wall, and they had all left prior to the Civil War. Most of them had gone to Israel. Some went to France. A few came to Canada. But my immediate family, my nuclear family, had stayed in Lebanon until it became impossible to stay in Lebanon once the war broke out. We were there during the first year of the Civil War, and then we came to Montreal at the end of that year in the mid-70s. And then for the next few years, my parents kept going back and forth to Lebanon, a very ill-advised decision, but it was very hard for them to assimilate in Canada. They were already well into their 40s. They still had business interests in Lebanon. And on one of their return trips to Lebanon, about 4 or 5 years after we had emigrated to Canada, they were kidnapped by Abu Nidal's group, Fatah, and some really bad things happened to them. So the things that people now have top of mind in terms of October 7th is basically called my childhood. So that's the world I come from. And this is why, if I may just finish with this point, this is why some of the staunchest defenders of American exceptionalism are usually immigrants such as myself, because we weren't born with the default value of being in America. So we've sampled from the buffet of societies out there, and we could then come to the United States and say, hey guys, don't take it for granted. United States is an anomaly within the trajectory of human history. And you're a historian, so you certainly know this as well as I do. And so it's people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Gad Saad that stand on top of the mountain and say, what are you guys doing? You're going to lose it. And as Ronald Reagan explained, and obviously you know this, he said something like, you know, in every generation you're going to have to recommit to defending the freedoms. And yet most Americans are blissfully apathetic in their stupor.
We are such a large country. It's hard to quite imagine the horror that is actually normal in large parts of the planet. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War in 75, I think people thought of Lebanon as one of the most successful balancing acts between Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and other sects that were existing. It found if you will, an architecture that enabled them to live with each other. And then when it did fall apart, it fell apart with a savagery that was, I think, in 1970, if you'd said how bad it was going to get, no one would have believed you.
Forgive me for pushing back a bit on your point. Yes, Lebanon was the model of coexistence in the context of the Middle East, and therefore it's called the Paris of the Middle East and so on. That doesn't mean that it was as liberal in the capital, like in the sense of social tolerance, as you would expect historically in the United States. So let me give you some examples of endemic Jew hatred that I experienced prior to the breakout of the Civil War. So in 1970, when I was not yet 6 years old, is the first vivid memory that I have of having been exposed to Jew hatred. Gamal Abdel Nasser had just died. He was the pan-Arabist Egyptian president who, was trying to unify all the Arab states into sort of one monolithic people. And so he was very much revered as a populist, blah, blah, blah. And then when he passed away, as often happens in the Middle East, people take to the street with full fervor, screaming incantations and so on. And as I was sitting there, a 5-year-old boy, as they're proceeding down my street, all I'm hearing is death to Jews, death to Jews. So I turn to my mother and say, Mom, why are they saying death to Jews? She goes, just put your head down. Don't put your head up, on the balcony. So that was the first time where I said, why are a bunch of people saying death to me? What do I have to do with this guy having been killed? Second story, I'll tell you maybe 2 more, just to kind of push back against the idea that Lebanon was a kumbaya. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, so about a year or 2 before the Civil War started, the teacher asks us to each stand up and say what we're going to be when we grow up. I want to be a soccer player. I want to be a policeman. I want to be a doctor. Well, one kid gets up, and I still have the class photo, and I could point to that kid. He says, when I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer, to everybody's raucous laughter and applause. That was fully normalized, right? The teacher didn't say, you are now going to be expelled from school. Third quick story, although I could give you many more. My brother was Lebanese judo champion many years in a row. He was once approached after he had done the very shameful thing of having a Jew win consistently the Lebanese championship. He was approached by some men who explained to him that he had to retire lest he might face an unfortunate accident. Well, he understood what that meant. He then moved to Paris, France to pursue his career. This was prior to the Civil War. Now, the irony of life is that in 1976, the Summer Olympics happened in Montreal, which is the city where we had moved to. So he ended up representing Lebanon in the 1976 Montreal Olympics. So in 1973, he suffered from the fatal disease called being Jewish. In 1976, we can forgive the fact that you are Jewish as long as you carry the Lebanese flag on the world stage. So yes, Lebanon was, quote, a model of tolerance, but not tolerance as Americans would typically understand.
When did you think it began to go sour?
Yeah, fantastic question. So all of the parasitic ideas that I lay out in the Parasitic Mind, so postmodernism, cultural relativism, social constructivism, radical feminism, victimology ethos, each of those parasitic ideas started in academia, depending on the parasitic idea, somewhere between 50 to 100 years ago. So for example, cultural relativism, who are you to judge the cultural values of another society, was actually started, regrettably so, by a Jewish anthropologist named Franz Boas. Postmodernism, which is the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas because it purports that there are no objective truth, up is down, men are women, slavery is freedom, right? Well, that was really developed by a bunch of degenerate French postmodernists, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. And so I would say it all went south, depending on the bad idea, 50 to 100 years ago. But then it takes time before the virus breaks out of the lab. It starts off in some nonsensical humanities department, but then it becomes Mamdani. Then it becomes Justin Trudeau. So these things take a while before you see the nefarious consequences downstream.
You know so much. When you've really thought about it so deeply, I find every time we have a chance to talk like this, I get an education. I want to thank you for joining me. I do want to remind folks that your new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to Be Kind, is available on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere, and it is now the #1 New York Times bestseller. And I think you're doing very important work, and I hope you'll keep doing it.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Gad Saad. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Guernsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.